Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is another edition of our Smart Cities and Connected Communities Roundtable discussions. And our think tank now has grown to about 700 thought leaders from around the world. Our topic today is broadband access and equity. And my name is Clint Vince. I chair Denton's U.S. energy practice and co-chair our global energy sector with my teammate Emma Hand. And Emma and I also co-chair this think tank. I'm really excited about today's panel, and we'll be coming to you again from globally as well as domestically. We'll start with Tiago Rodriguez, who is the CEO of the prestigious Wireless Broadband Alliance. Then my dear friend, Erin Spears, who runs the Utility Regulatory Office for the New Orleans City Council. She's actually juggling a council meeting as we speak, which these meetings are televised and media present. So we will have, we hope to have Erin for the full session, but if she gets pulled away, we know you'll understand. And we have another dear friend, Alice Moy Gonzalez, who is Senior VP for Strategic Development at Ontarix. Very exciting company that is bringing wireless private LTE networks to the utility industry. In addition, we have David Guilford, who leads Sidewalk Labs, Policy and Strategic Partnerships, Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. And we have my partner and good friend Todd Dobert, who heads Denton's telecommunications and technology practice. And so with that, let's get right into it. And Tiago, let's start. And I'm going to ask you your perspective from, you're in Lisbon, Portugal. How do you see the issue of broadband access and equity from a global perspective, and what do some of your members describe to you?
Yeah, thank you, Clinton. So good morning, everyone. So first of all, a big thank you for the invitation to be on this lovely webinar and panel with such a prestigious group. Just to give a quick background, so the Wireless Broadband Alliance is a global non-profit trade association. We have members, major carriers and technology providers from all over the world. And the group, we look to broadband connectivity as a core element of societies today, same level as highways, roadways, water systems, electric grids. And the recent COVID-19 pandemic just shows that. So broadband connectivity was critical for all of us to maintain our jobs, stay connected with our family and friends, our children, and to study, to entertain ourselves, and even to buy whatever goods we need to get from during the COVID. So it was all about the broadband connectivity. So it's a key element of modern societies today. And there is, as we all know, the risk of digital divide between those that have access to broadband connectivity and the ones that don't have it, or they don't know how to use it. But I can share, maybe later on the session, I can share some good initiatives that many of our members are involved, including the association, are involved around the world on awesome programs and projects have been in place in different regions of the world to tackle that digital divide and make broadband connectivity a central point for all of us around the world.
Tiago, thank you for the introduction, and go ahead and please do give us 2 or 3 examples of some of the more exciting initiatives that your members are undertaking.
Yeah, I can share couple of them. So one it's in Singapore. So Singapore is a very small country, is a city nation. So they have that big advantage, and they have a very vast fiber to the home program. So they like to claim that they have 99.99% fiber coverage for all the citizens. And on top of that, with the collaboration with the Alliance and other organizations, they developed a national Wi-Fi network that is free for all the citizens and all the visitors. So this shows that not only broadband connectivity, it's critical for them, but as well, they are looking to ways to facilitate internet connectivity, in this case with Wi-Fi on a national network. As I mentioned, it's a city nation, so it's easier for them to deploy a wide Wi-Fi network, but it's a good example that can be replicated and explored by other geographies. Another example, it's here in Europe. So the European Commission has been very supportive of one initiative that is called Wi-Fi for EU, and they have been providing funds to small villages and communities around Europe, across Europe, to help to fund Wi-Fi networks. They have more than 30,000 villages and towns that they apply to this program. And we have been working with the European Commission to facilitate roaming between those municipalities. So in such a way, if I live in France and by whatever reason I need to move to Germany, or I go to holidays in Italy, why I could not connect using the same credential or the same identity that I have in France. So we have been working with them to make that roaming easier. Even if it's free Wi-Fi, there is an angle for roaming. And for example, we did several pilots, including with universities, where the university students can use whatever password and identity that they have on the university. They can go to all these free Wi-Fi hotspots around Europe, and they can use the same identity. So they don't need to ask anyone else for any other information. They can just log in and connect and take advantage of the internet.
Very helpful, Tiago, and we will come back in a moment and ask you about challenges, but let's move to Aaron Spears, again, the head of the New Orleans City Council Utilities Regulatory Office. And Aaron, can you take us from global to sort of a case study of New Orleans, maybe cover some of the your present assessment of broadband access? What segment of the population would you estimate don't have consistent access to broadband, and how does that play out in the lives that you are seeing and hearing from in your role?
No, absolutely. And, I'm happy to be here and really excited to have this conversation and really excited to learn more about what Tiago was talking about. It's interesting that Europe can make internet access a priority across a continent, and we're going to have a hard time doing it down here in Louisiana. So this is fascinating. Now, Clint, you make an excellent point here in New Orleans. The latest data, and I think it's even optimistic, shows that 37% of our households don't have a fixed internet connection. So they are reliant upon cell phones and data plans or public Wi-Fi hotspots in order to do what I think many of us realized and maybe even took for granted before the pandemic, to make their lives work. So paying bills when you aren't supposed to be, intermingling households, going to doctor's visits, studying. There was a heartbreaking story during the pandemic last year where two students, in order to do their homework, were using a Wi-Fi hotspot from a fast food restaurant. So they were sitting in the parking lot trying to do homework using laptops that were on loan to them from their schools. There are also stories of these laptops that schools are giving to students being the only internet connected device in an entire home. And so parents are relying on that to pay bills. And even take a minute and watch some television or catch up on the news. There's so many things that even I didn't realize are internet dependent until the pandemic, that was just underscored and highlighted in a way that's very real, particularly the fact that internet is not a utility. So when you have utility assistance programs, when you have initiatives to ensure that you have water and electricity and gas service, you don't have the same effort to make sure that you have internet access. And I think one of the major shifts that I'm sure we'll talk about later is this push for internet service and broadband service to be recognized as a utility, as something that you need in order to function in the world. So that's what I'm working on, just down here in New Orleans. Really easy stuff.
Well, it really brings the seriousness of this discussion home in a very, very compelling way. And one of the things we'll be discussing with our panelists is why is it taking so long to at least move the needle at scale on this issue? But Erin, can you talk a little bit about the utility concept that you just developed? Let's get into that right now.
Well, I'm still working on it, but because New Orleans has this unique space of regulating a utility, we get insight into what that process should look like. For example, the basic thing of setting rates. Right now, when we are opening a docket, the council and local government officials can set rates. And that takes into account things like the needs of the people and income levels and the needs of the utility providing the service. We have none of that in the telecom, cable, internet access space. So we get the phone call, I can't pay my Cox bill or my AT&T bill, and there's nothing we can do. The only recourse a citizen has is to appeal to the FCC. And that's not a speedy process. And so even when you talk about market competition, if the city of New Orleans was to try to be an internet service provider and offer a low-cost internet service, we would be met with a lot of force from the telecom industry, particularly under an act that many other state legislatures have that says municipalities cannot compete in this space. And if they do compete in this space, they cannot offer lower internet service packages. They can't take advantage of the fact that they own the rights of way. They can't, give themselves access to certain fees and benefits, and they can't undercut the other companies in this space. So yeah, Clint, welcome any ideas that you guys have on how to fix this problem, but I'm working on it.
Well, it's a huge problem. So we are going to have to figure out a fix for it. And when Erin mentions that the city of New Orleans has regulatory authority over utilities within its jurisdiction, it's one of only 2 cities in the United States that have that jurisdiction over private companies. There are many public systems where there are municipally owned utilities, but not only 2 that have regulatory authority over private companies. The other one is the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. And so what Erin's describing really gives New Orleans some unique authority to try to make a dent here, but it sounds as though there'll need to be some support from the legislature in Louisiana as well. And let me just mention, and I'm going to call on Todd in a second, but let me just mention, I should have at the beginning of our discussion, that we've got a Q&A feature on this platform. So if you have questions, please definitely put them into the Q&A feature. Please don't use the chat room because I'll only be monitoring Q&A. But we'd love to hear from you. And Todd, you have a comment, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in on what Erin and you had said about the issue of how unique New Orleans is, because when Aaron said that maybe you could appeal to the FCC doesn't even have jurisdiction to address those types of issues directly. And, you know, for the most part, when we came up through competition and when broadband started getting rolled out, a lot of it was deregulated almost completely, both at the federal and the state level. And, you know, as you mentioned, it's very rare that a municipality would regulate. Now, that's not to say that there are no relevant regulations, but as a topic, as a cohesive retail service, a lot of this was deregulated, as was voice over internet protocol. And so what you find is it used to be an optional service that stood alongside the utility services, the traditional voice services. And so deregulation was viewed as a way to speed deployment and get things out and cut through red tape. Well, now what's happened is that it's become the service. And I'm not saying that the answer is to impose regulations on everything, but I am pointing out that it's a very real phenomenon that this very critical service, frequently for end users, there's nowhere to go to talk about it directly as to how it affects you and your personal bill.
Thank you, Todd. And we're going to come back and talk about challenges and fixes. But Alice Moy-Gonzalez, again, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development at Ontarix, if you could tell us a little bit about your company is becoming well known now for really a breakthrough spectrum technology approach of creating private LTE networks for utilities. Can you talk a little bit about Ontarix, a little bit about that approach, and then advise us on what the application of that approach might have to help solve this problem?
Certainly. And first of all, Clint, thank you very much for having me on the panel today and with this great group of speakers. So much that I've heard so far from Tiago and Aaron and Todd. I want to jump right in and talk more about it. But just to answer your questions first, our approach as we work primarily with utilities, regulated utilities, electric and also gas utilities in the US, is that a modern grid requires modern communications. So our focus in working with utilities as they look at their grid modernization programs, they are investing heavily in telecommunications as a strategic asset. So I'm going to take a different spin to this conversation, as the use cases that really drive the large electric utilities to invest in broadband really stem from the two-way power flows that's coming on to the grid. You think about whether it's planned or unplanned events, so planned being big decarbonization goals. You need to support that. There's cybersecurity, you need to protect the grid, and also resiliency is also a must. And what that means is that you need to have deep situational awareness, what's happening on the grid at all times. You need to be able to monitor your assets and control it. And when utilities take a step back and look at all of the different use cases that are coming on to their grid, then sometimes it gets compounded by different things like wildfires in California. How do you support that and what technologies you put on? So because of that, there is a growing wave of utilities that are making strategic investments in broadband connectivity that is utility owned. And they're doing it because they see the need for the importance of the need to serve their customers, right? And I think that's different between telecommunications providers that look at the cost to serve. And I think that's a big difference here. Utilities are putting in all of these grid modernization programs to support their assets and support their customers where they have it. And as a result of it, what we're looking at is a mix of both wired and wireless communications that are coming online. We primarily focus within Ontarix the wireless side of communications. I mean, you think about wireless, we all walk around with these cell phones on a daily basis. And some of the applications that Erin talked about, imagine if a student is using their laptop, most likely it's in a mobile type environment. So wireless is also a key part of a broadband infrastructure, but a wireless technology, usually you look at an end device, you have the airwaves, which is a spectrum that Ontarix supports on a 900 megahertz network, but also the infrastructure that supports it would be towers, it would be the backhaul connectivity, which would include fiber. That all goes into a head-end application system, which is the brains of the network, where all of the data and analytics come into play. But what we've seen from utilities, as there's this growing interest of broadband from folks like Southern Link, from Ameren in Illinois and Missouri, from Evergy and San Diego Gas and Electric as some key examples, is that there's a common infrastructure that can be leveraged while utilities are focused on implementing these networks for their grid modernization needs. There's a big opportunity here. And that opportunity is to leverage the towers, fiber backhaul that could also be a big part of the puzzle piece to help solve this digital divide. But I think both Todd and Erin were talking about solving this issue and how could you do it. And what we're finding, it's really partnerships, right? It's going to be a key part of, we're all trying to figure this out together. I don't think any one organization or entity would be able to solve it. But what we're learning, it's a three-legged stool. It's a technology, it's a partnerships, and it's also the legislation to make it happen.
And you have technology experts on this call, you have developers, you have regulator expertise. How would you assemble them all in one tent to assist with collaboration?
That's a great question, Clint. It's one that was poised to us a number of times. Every time we talk about facilitating utility broadband, the question would come up from especially regulators, how could they leverage this infrastructure? And we embarked on a very important, but it was also a fun project in developing and sponsoring a utility broadband playbook, which was a collaboration of utilities that had interest already embarked on supporting the digital divide, along with speaking with regulators that were supportive of it and internet service providers. So what this playbook did was look at both the challenges and opportunities with utilities leveraging this infrastructure, supporting the digital divide. And in it, there was 7 utilities that participated that shared their experience. And what we learned from each of them is that there's a common need here. They're able to use their infrastructure, but being able to engage with legislators are very important. One of the 7 utilities that comes to mind is Alabama Power, where they worked with their regulators to get support to leverage their middle mile infrastructure to lease the excess dark fiber that could be provided to the internet service providers. And the points that they made in the playbook and in the interviews is the utilities build their networks to a higher level of resiliency, because that's what they need for their mission critical systems. So the leases of that spectrum ultimately benefit from that, because you're not just getting excess capacity, you're getting excess capacity that gives you the reliability that you need. So this playbook was definitely one example of different folks coming together to help address this issue, to identify that there is precedent. There is precedent that it can be done, that the utilities and the internet service providers can work together to help solve this issue.
Thank you, Alice. Great insight. A moment ago, you mentioned middle mile. For members of our audience that may not be as familiar with that term, can you give us a little bit more explanation? And
absolutely. Any network, if you think about it, it has 2 sides to it. One side is the end device that we're familiar with, which would be your laptop or your cell phone or a sensor. But then there's a transport layer, and there's typically two layers of transport. The last mile is what we're usually familiar with. It's airwaves like Tiago spoke about. It could be Wi-Fi, it's 4G, 5G, different technologies there. But then there's a middle point of which there's backhaul communications back to your servers, where that middle mile infrastructure may be fiber, or it could also be microwave that's backhauling all of that data to your data centers. So that middle mile infrastructure, which could include your fiber, microwave, or tower assets, it's what the utilities are generally looking at leveraging to support the digital divide.
Thank you, Alice. And you can easily see why Public Utility Fortnightly recently gave Alice one of their top innovator awards. Todd, did you have a comment?
Yeah, again, I wanted to echo in on what Alice was talking about. I've had the pleasure of representing Southern Link for a couple of decades, so really familiar with them. And a few points that she raised, well, all of her points were great, but to add on to a few of them, utilities are very interesting because their incentives and their goals for their broadband networks are fundamentally different than a company that is focused on providing telecommunications or broadband service to the retail. Because the utility, by and large, is doing this so that they can ensure hardened networks and availability so they can communicate during hurricanes, natural disasters, and everything else to keep their network going. So their networks are actually designed differently. And because they're designed differently, they actually could be a key part in solving the rural broadband because the electrical networks and other utility networks go throughout all the rural areas. So they build their broadband networks so that they can communicate wherever their network is, which is unlike a telecom provider where profitability can be driven by population density. So it's a very interesting point, something that's very important to consider because that's always caused some friction sometimes between traditional telecom and utility provided telecom because their goals and the way they view the world are slightly different. The other thing I would say is, and I'll get into this more later in my comments, one thing we should really start thinking about is we don't have more broadband deployment, sometimes not because of the big things, but because of the little things. And I would, Alice's point about shared infrastructure can't be emphasized enough. Shared infrastructure is one of the keys to getting ubiquitous broadband coverage. But if you're going to do that, we need to think about how we design these pieces of equipment that we're using. And let's talk about pole attachments, because the poles that electrical utility uses have traditionally been designed for electrical, and you can use them for other purposes, but they get very concerned about having third parties get on these poles, have a risk of life, have a risk of taking down the power network. And so you have this friction, this internal built-in friction about opening up this possibility to third parties freely. And I think that if we can be visionary and start creating things like poles where you don't have to have overlashing, you can have modular things where you plug in a safe, rapid, efficient way. You could even think of your roadways the same way. If every time we put in a roadway, if we had ducts that were way overbuilt that you just sat in almost like prefab, we could build in this country, in all of our rights of way and all of our infrastructure, the keys to ensuring that multiple people could get access to provide broadband. And I'll sort of stop there, but it's really an important point.
It is, and we're going to want to come back to that, Todd. And I saw Erin nodding her head as well as you were speaking. So hold that thought because I want to develop it further. David Guilford is our next panelist. As I mentioned, David he leads policy and strategic partnerships for Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. And in a prior organization of particular interest to us, David was co-founder of the Broadband Equity Partnership. And he has focused for a number of years on designing digital and social infrastructure to close the divide. So David, let's get you unmuted, and why don't you describe a little bit more about Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners and some of your life's work on working on the digital divide.
Sure. Thanks for that introduction, Clinton. It's great to be a part of this panel. I mean, so many of the comments that we've been discussing touch on the different aspects of both the digital divide, from sort of infrastructure challenges to policy challenges to affordability challenges, but also kind of how connected and how many partnerships are needed in order to find real solutions. So I think my own career sort of has spanned the public and private sector. So working in city government, working in advising the city of New York, right, in previous to the COVID-19 pandemic, in looking at sort of the challenge, because just like New Orleans, New York, where I am, it's something close to 30% of households still lack broadband access at home, which is kind of shocking in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. But the reason why we're focused on the work that I'm doing at Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners is this recognition that technology has been evolving faster than our infrastructure and our policies have been evolving, and that critical infrastructure, whether you're talking about roadways or energy systems or broadband, separate from whether we're calling this a utility, people are relying on it in the same way that they rely upon utilities. We believe that the way forward is to be very systematic in thinking through what the future of digital infrastructure looks like. We organize ourselves around innovation platforms. So CoFi, for example, is the name of our digital innovation platform. And in recognizing that there are these urgent challenges that cities face, that technology isn't enough on its own. So we seek to find public-private partnerships in working with the city or a school district or others who are trying to solve a problem, and then bringing the right technology. I also want to pick up on one of Todd's points that I think is really central here, because we certainly believe that infrastructure needs to be shared where possible and where it makes sense. And even things like pole attachments that people don't really think of as infrastructure, the right or the ability to install hardware on the top of a utility pole and having a good process for doing that, but also the technology that can enable the better sharing. We see that as a real big opportunity going forward. A company we recently acquired called DenseAir has technology that we believe is really fundamental for this, and that is to be able to take a single radio, the same type of radio that a carrier would use to provide broadband or mobile internet access, and virtualize it and enable multiple users to share that same hardware, the same power, the same fiber that is required, so that a municipality that's looking to provide service, utility that's looking to provide service, that different applications can rely on the same hardware, not go through redundant permitting processes and digging up streets multiple times. All of those types of things, I think, are really central to finding new ways. And also want to echo what Alice said, that like the partnerships are really critical to this, because no one company, no one sector has all the answers, but really requires strong partnerships to succeed.
What are some examples of projects you've got or have worked on previously that are making a difference?
Sure. So the company DenseAir that I mentioned is doing some pretty interesting work in Europe. I think it's interesting to look at like what's transferable and what's not when you're thinking about, say, I know we've in this webinar already talked about sort of, cities as diverse as Singapore and New Orleans. From some work that we've done in places like Dublin, we've found that there's a real interest from the public sector to find new, more sustainable business models for delivering connectivity, thinking primarily about city services. but that also mobile carriers can be open to sort of new ways of doing things and new ways of sharing. Because in the U.S., I think for a number of historical reasons, it's probably there's been less of that sharing than has happened elsewhere in places like New Zealand, for example, where there's a sort of a history of sharing macro sites and sort of cellular infrastructure. I do think that finding examples from different jurisdictions and bringing them to other cities is really critical here, because we're talking about such important infrastructure. No one really wants to be the first to try something, but also we know that we need to do better than the status quo. So figuring out how to make it easier to be the second city to do something, I think is a pretty important task.
And it's, Tiago had mentioned Singapore, which annually is generally rated as the top city in the world from a smart cities accomplishment perspective. And it's one of the nice things is when you look at some of these rankings, you can see what the top 10 cities around the world, for example, have done specifically to earn those rankings. And that helps us develop concepts for other locations. Singapore, as Tiago mentioned, is really a city state and also very wealthy location. And so not everything that is done there can immediately apply to some of our other geographical locations that might not have those characteristics, but there is a lot that is transferable from around the world. So Todd, you are up actually. And why don't you make your comment, and then I just want you to explain to us what we've been looking at this issue for a number of years now. Why can't we solve it more quickly? But let's hear your comment first.
Well, again, I sound like I'm just riding everybody's coattails, and I'm happy to do it with a group like this. But anybody who knows me knows that I've been talking about the importance of sharing infrastructure for years. And so I think David's comments are exactly on. That's really hard to do. And in fact, in the 1996 Telecom Act, that was the whole theory. We said that we're going to foster competition in 3 ways. One is you could enter directly with your own facilities and your own investment. At the other end of the spectrum is we were going to require existing providers to allow resale. And the middle route was we were going to require the existing providers to allow competitors to use certain elements of their network at a wholesale cost, sort of an unbundled network elements, if people remember that. And the whole thought was that would allow providers to get into the marketplace, earn money and build up market share so that they could get enough profits to get their own facilities. So unis and resale were never really meant to be long-term. They were meant to be paths to getting this to work. And it failed. And it failed, that's an overstatement. It didn't completely fail. It didn't work in the way the designers of the law thought it would work. And one of the problems with the shared network infrastructure, the unis, is that if the utilities are going to do everything they can do to fight it and to undermine it in big and little ways, and the government is unwilling and arguably unable to go in and make them behave, then it's never going to be a viable long-term path for competitors to get into the marketplace. And so the whole and then that the 96 Act was adopted in a Democratic administration. And so then right when it starts to take off, the Republicans take over and they have a very different view of it. And so they didn't enforce it in the way. So I don't know whether it might have eventually have worked if we had stuck with it. The truth is we didn't stick with it. And so that the sharing of infrastructure is really, really hard, but it is so absolutely critical. And one of the reasons why, Clint asked a great question about, we've been talking about this for decades and it doesn't get any better. It doesn't matter which administration's in power. So my comments aren't meant to be political. And people have frequently asked, well, why not? And I think one of the problems is that in order for broadband to be successful, every single link in the chain has to be perfect. Because if one falls out, you get nothing. And so the way I've explained this to people is it's like your home network. You have to have really good, fast broadband service to your house. You have to have a really fast router or inside wiring or whatever you're doing. And you have to have really good devices. Because if you have a fast connection and you have a great router, but you don't have devices, you, as a practical matter, don't have broadband. Or if you have a really fast internet, connection to your house and you have great devices, but your router is from 1996, you're not going to experience broadband. Or you can have the best router in the world, the best device, and not have a fast enough connection, and you don't have broadband. And so that's why I think it's really difficult to actually get broadband, because it's almost like you have a series of monopolies. So you'll have a middle mile where one provider is the only one who has that middle mile for that particular area. And if they're not running the middle mile in a way that's designed to share that connection or open access, well, then it doesn't matter if you have the last mile covered. You're never going to be able to get high speeds. So I think when you look, same thing in the wireless world, right? Most of the wireless carriers sold off all their towers to tower companies. So now you've got 2 or 3 tower companies, three mainly tower companies out there. And even though they compete with each other, in any given area, there's usually one tower. So you have to deal with them, or you won't have the ability to have the coverage that you want. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. And so I think that's why it's so hard to get ubiquitous broadband, because solving one piece at a time doesn't get you broadband. You have to solve all the pieces at a time, and the pieces aren't necessarily controlled by the same people or even under the same jurisdiction of various different government elements. So when we look at this from a policy standpoint, I think we need to really have a longer term vision to try to facilitate more open access, to try to make it easier when we do support efforts through tax breaks or through funding, government funding, to make sure that we're saying, all right, how will this element help with all the other ones, and start making it more like a Tinker Toys, so that you've got this sort of interoperability idea sort of baked into it. And that's really hard to do. But if we don't start looking at each piece, from the poles to the last mile, to the towers, to the middle mile, and thinking about how can we leverage this? How can we make sure that this can meet multiple needs? We're never going to get there. And, if you look at, there are also little things we need to do in the particular agencies. Let's take the FCC. Until the FCC gets a 5th commissioner, we will have no meaningful decisions to support broadband. It can't happen. And again, I don't mean that as a political statement. I just mean 2 versus 2 doesn't work. You end up compromising to the point where nothing meaningful will happen. Number 2, most of the funding is based on maps. In the end, it's tied to maps. Until we get good broadband and other maps and data that we need, we're not going to move this forward as quickly as we need to. So, this would be easy. This would be a lot easier if we had sort of central control. And I'm not advocating that from a political standpoint, but over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working on SoFi Stadium in Hollywood Park in Inglewood, California, for the home of the Rams and the Chargers. And so we did, Stan Kroenke, who owns all of that, has the advantage of he did all that with private funding. And it's like a smart city. It's 300 acres in Los Angeles, right? So we're not in the business of making money from the broadband, right? But we absolutely want world-class broadband throughout Hollywood Park. And that gives them a huge advantage because then they can drive all of that shared infrastructure. Everything in that place is designed to share all the infrastructure, including within the stadium, because the stadium is beautiful. And the whole premise of the stadium is that it's world-class, beautiful facilities. So you can't have 3 carriers going in building their own networks within the stadium, which is built 100 feet into the ground because it's close to the airport there. So it's a hole. Until we put in the networks, you did not get any signal there. And so we were able to get a DAS system set up with 3 carriers on it. And it's shocking how good it is, because I was there for the Super Bowl, and before the Super Bowl started, I was getting 900 meg down to my phone. And during the middle of the Super Bowl, with over 70,000 people there, with everybody using their devices, I was still getting 300 to 400 meg down. And it shows to me the promise of shared infrastructure and what we could do in an ideal world. And it also shows the challenges of why it's so hard, absent having control over beginning to end and the right incentives of just wanting to have good service there, not trying to milk it for every last dollar, how hard it is to achieve it.
I think that each of you ought to write this up in an essay. I see Jennifer Morrissey on our screen, who is the co-chair of the editorial board of our think tank. What you're saying is so powerful, each of you, that it and so on target, that I'd love to see an essay come out of this that we could share with our think tank. David Guilford, Todd mentioned funding. Do you see funding opportunities coming as a result of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, for example? Are there other opportunities that are going to be helpful here? And then Tiago, I'm going to come back to you and go in sequence again, and I'll ask you a little bit about some of the challenges you're seeing globally and some of the solutions that you're seeing. You named a few great ones early on.
So if there's a silver lining in terms of just the attention that the COVID pandemic brought to the digital divide, it is that for the first time, certainly as far as I can remember, there is significant federal funding that's flowing directly towards this issue. And it sort of started with the CARES Act funding, which a number of communities were able to do, everything from buying hotspots to distribute to students to be able to use at home, to building out CBRS-based radio networks. And then now you have the American Rescue Plan Act funding that is going to also some innovative projects. And then as you alluded to, Clint, the bipartisan infrastructure law is itself going to result in the sort of the single largest pool of money distributed for broadband infrastructure. It's over $60 billion in all. About 42, a little over 42 of that is something called the BEAD program that the NTIA will be distributing, that really is going to fund new infrastructure for broadband. I think one of the biggest challenges, though, ahead is that the getting from federal allocation to projects in the ground requires not only the kind of tactical things around picking technology, picking vendors, and everything like that, but also figuring out where and how do you distribute that funding and how to allocate. There are lots of worthy ways that it theoretically could be used. So with that in mind, the FCC is undertaking a mapping process to look at where is there the greatest need for this. And the broadband sector, unfortunately, has been plagued by very poor data in terms of what actually is where the gap really is. So for those not familiar with that, there's basically self-reported data from internet service providers that is then aggregated by the FCC so that people can see, oh, this area is served or not served. But both because it's not granular enough and because it doesn't reflect the actual delivered speeds and qualities, it's not a great representation to date of where there really is the need for new infrastructure. So there's a lot of efforts underway. The state of New York's been doing some of its own mapping efforts to both get better information on where the infrastructure exists, but also to connect with individuals and really ensure that the end user experience is really what it's claimed in the sort of marketing materials and the other self-reported data. So all this is to say is that there's a significant amount of funding that will be flowing. There's some issues regarding timing. And then also when you think about the scale of the country, $42 billion is unfortunately not going to cover everything that we need, which really does make public-private partnerships essential, especially if you think about the difference between installing, whether it's fiber or wireless infrastructure, and then maintaining it over the coming years and decades, in which cities are not going to be able to expect that the federal government will always be providing subsidies. So figuring out what is the right set of business models for each, for each use case that we're trying to address is critical. I think that's where, certainly from perspective of Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, that is both it's both a challenge, but also it's an opportunity, because we believe that if you can bring together technology, perhaps some federal support for the core infrastructure, and then build business models on top of that rely on multiple funding streams instead of just one, you're much more likely to have long-term success and not end up with some of the problems that we saw with the first generation of public Wi-Fi projects, where a lot of stuff is installed, it works great for a couple years, and then people stop maintaining it. There isn't a clear way to keep it funded, and it doesn't really live up to the promise. So my hope is that this is a catalytic moment, but we also can't rely on the federal funding to solve problems permanently.
Thank you, David. Tiago, you have heard challenges and concerns in the United States. What are you seeing around the globe with your organization, and where are you seeing additional solutions to some of the things that are slowing us down?
Yeah, so first of all, it's been a fantastic share of information between all of us. Overall, the challenges are very similar around the globe. Of course, we can pick up some examples like Singapore or Dubai, or where there is a specific geographic and historical reason to somehow to be more advanced than other locations. But when we look to the common challenges, I think we already debate as well many of what I believe can be the common solutions. So everything that Todd said about shared resources. So at least from the telecom carriers that I'm more close to, they are more than ever willing to share infrastructure. And like you said, Todd, in a stadium, they can share a DAS system. Maybe in airports, they will do the same. And that is a key element to optimize as well investments, because the telecom carriers as well, their profitability has been changing over the time, and the money that they were making probably 20 years ago is not the same that they're doing today. So their profitability levels, in my opinion, wake them up to be more innovative in different solutions. So shared resources is one of them. Another one that I see a lot of work is in terms of heterogeneous networks. So the telecom operators, they don't need to deploy all the services under the same infrastructure. So I can do no need to use cellular technology to deliver every single service that I do. I can combine maybe cellular 4G, 5G, maybe with Wi-Fi, or maybe with some other technology, IoT technology that is unlicensed. And at the core of my network, I can optimize those capabilities to be able to provide the same level of service using different technology assets that may be available. And that brings to another angle that was mentioned by Alice a lot, that is the partnerships. I believe we are entering in an era where enterprises, municipalities, utilities, telecom carriers, they need to start sitting on the table and discuss how can I use and utilize the different resources, infrastructure available, regardless of the ownership, and somehow align on plans to deploy and use those technologies. Because does it make sense that if there is a shopping mall that already have whatever infrastructure they have, why are the mobile carriers putting, I don't know, antennas all over around the shopping mall? just to have indoor coverage from the outside. So these type of discussions are in place already. Probably will take time. Is not the question that suddenly from the day to the night will transform everything, but the telecom carriers are much open to that. And a final topic is about as well the convergence of the technology. So the technology is evolving a lot. And particularly on the wireless side is coming all this concept of private cellular, where enterprises can suddenly start to deploy, get authorizations to get their own private cellular networks in their premises. And that will open up another huge front of dialogue between mobile carriers, enterprises, in some cases municipalities, to discuss how can we utilize those resources and how can we find innovative business models that a shopping mall, for example, or even an hospital or a stadium, like Todd said, I can provide different services to my users as they are coming into my venue, but at the same time, I can use part of that infrastructure that a mobile carrier can provide whatever services they want to provide to their users. And sometimes it can even extend for a partnership with a local government or even for a federal government. Can I provide a free service for unconnected communities as part of that agreement? So it's a very difficult puzzle to crack. But I see some positive signs on some of these topics, as I said, and many of you already shared. So sharing resources, more partnerships, more interoperability between technologies, more convergence of services. I think the evolution of the broadband and wireless connectivity is coming from that angle. And not expecting that the telecom operator will cover everything everywhere with the same technology.
Thank you, Tiago. It sounds like WBA would be a perfect convener on these issues. Are you doing convening or on this subject?
Yeah, we are.
I know you have a meeting in Chicago.
Yeah, we have a meeting in Chicago coming up in June 8 and 9. We have been working more on the technology front. For example, I can share some examples of what is on the forefront of innovation. So why a cellular phone or a smartphone cannot use Wi-Fi and cellular at the same time to increase bandwidth, to increase speed. Many times I'm at home, I have my Wi-Fi, I have cellular coverage, but my phone basically just pick one at a time. But he has the capability to pick up both of them. So why don't innovate on that front? Because in some cases it may help a lot to increase more bandwidth for whatever type of service that we need. The other work that we have been doing quite a lot is how to develop more converged services. Why we cannot have voice data services over a free Wi-Fi network? Why do I need to use all the time the cellular network? Almost mandating that the cellular coverage needs to be every single corner, every single building, every single room in the world. So if we can make those technologies more convergence, and of course it's very complicated because it needs quality and needs policy and needs security and needs privacy and all those things. But if we can make the technology work there, I think there are substantial benefits for all of us.
Thank you, Tiago. Aaron, I know that you're bouncing between a city council meeting and this discussion, but I saw that I saw you nodding your head frequently in the conversation. What are you hearing that resonates with you? What challenges do you consider to continue to see, and what potential solutions would you deploy if you could wave your magic wand?
So, I mean, the thing that really hits home for me is mapping and infrastructure issues. New Orleans is over 300 years old, and some of our infrastructure dates back to Thomas Edison. I know AT&T infrastructure here dates back to the 1890s. And so when you're trying to identify where there are resources and where there are gaps in infrastructure, it becomes really difficult and a complex, almost archaeological exercise. And then, you know, in a 300-year-old historic city, you want to be deliberate when you are digging up a street and laying new fiber, laying conduits, and in a city where every dollar counts and has to go further than it does than other places, we've had a lot of situations where our maps weren't accurate. And so one company gets in the ground and accidentally cuts a line from another carrier or a utility, and you lose power in downtown New Orleans, or you lose cell service for a few blocks or internet service in a square mile area because our maps weren't accurate. Similarly, when you talk about consolidating infrastructure, part of what makes a historic city is that it looks like it did 300 years ago. That aesthetic is kind of ruined when you have 20 poles in a block. It doesn't really work, but convincing carriers to share infrastructure becomes a battle. And as Todd alluded to with the 1996 Act, when you talk about 5G deployment, we've had a similar deregulation and a similar limitation on what municipalities can and cannot require of new providers or new infrastructure to expedite that deployment. And so, yeah, if I could wave a magic wand, I think I would take Todd's suggestion and get a 5th FCC commissioner on there so that we can do some work in this space in particular. I mean, selfishly, this is the stuff that I deal with every day, so it would make my life a lot easier.
Thank you, Aaron. Wonderful answer. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, Aaron, no, it's absolutely right. And it's such a tough nut to crack, right? Because being honest, when it comes to municipalities, there are legitimate concerns, and people like you who are trying to, serve your constituents and make sure that you preserve the character of the city, which I think that nearly everyone would agree with. And then there are municipalities who are viewing this as just a means to get money, or concerned over 5G health, whether rightly or wrongly, and wanting to keep the infrastructure out altogether. And those aren't consistent. And so what happens is it's too hard to sort through those different concerns, because somebody who has an improper concern always dresses it up in a proper way, right? And so then the way we always address it is just to say you can't do it at all. So it becomes almost a race to the bottom. And it's why the partnerships are so critical. And I guess this goes back to the uni point and the shared infrastructure point. I am such a huge fan of shared infrastructure. I am such a huge fan of collaborative projects, because it's the only way this will work, the only way, because you cannot mandate cooperation. And you can't allow, and when I say monopoly, I don't mean necessarily in the antitrust sense, but you can't allow one provider to have the sole critical link when their incentives may not be aligned with all of the needs that are critically reliant on that particular link. So as we together as a team try to solve these issues, we need to find the ways to create the incentives for people to work together, as opposed to mandating one specific outcome in all places, where the technology is changing so fast and the needs are changing so fast that it's probably going to be outdated before the good results can even show up from the mandate.
It sounds like you've been listening into some of Aaron's city council meetings, Todd, and I've had the honor working with the New Orleans City Council almost for 40 years now. It seems like it was just yesterday that I started, but and Aaron has really taken the Utility Regulatory Office to a whole new level. So I'm optimistic that if at least incremental progress can be made, Aaron will find the way to do that. Alice, you've been hearing our riveting discussion. What additional observations do you have on challenges and solutions?
Yeah, this is definitely a big problem to unpack. But what we're identifying is that there are pathways to find solutions. When Tiago spoke about coming together, talk about technologies where you could be almost seamless from one into another, it is possible. And I think that's a key theme that I'm hearing around the room here. The possibilities exist. So then getting to Todd's theme on, what are the challenges, what are the obstacles that we need to face? And one part that we kept hearing is sometimes whether it's the policies or the legislation or the regulations do not allow it. So between one entity to another entity, let's say it's telecom to utility, sometimes, yes, the shared infrastructure may not automatically exist. But Clint, would you believe that even between utilities, because you know that utilities share service territories between electric, water, and gas, it's not always a given that they're allowed to share infrastructure. So what we've heard is that, yes, if they're allowed to open that up, there are opportunities here that you could provide more benefits to the end user at the end of the day. But I do see some good news, silver lining here. One recent example is NARUC. They did adopt language from the playbook that I mentioned before, and they passed a resolution which allows multiple PUCs to look at that language, where utilities that are investing in broadband infrastructure for their grid needs, there's also an opportunity to use that infrastructure to support broadband needs for the community. And there's some ripple effects that I actually saw as recent as, I think, last week in Texas, where they opened up some regulations there to support middle mile. So Todd, to your point, middle mile is just one part of the equation. It's not everything, but I think you need to have some of these precedents to move forward for folks to see it is possible. And it is happening. So that resolution is one that NARUC has. There are other associations or organizations that are bringing groups of folks, just like we are doing today, to speak about it, but also to develop playbooks or to develop different frameworks that you could embark on. So that, coupled with the funding that we talked about, is going to be a great catalyst to take some of the challenges that we saw before and give you those stepping stones to actually make this a reality. One other point that I'd like to bring up here is, going back to the theme of partnerships, we had developed what we call the Ontarix Active Ecosystem Program last year, which we started with about just over 30-something members. And the idea behind it is these private networks that were being built by utilities, you need to benefit from the same economies of scale that large carriers could benefit from. So how could you understand what type of devices you put on a network, what type of applications, look at it from an end-to-end standpoint, reduce risk, reduce complexity, make it happen faster. That type of partnership, is a program is really essential to solve the needs of implementing broadband across multiple industries. So really, I'd like to emphasize just looking at opportunities to bring different sets of partners in together. There we are able to influence different stakeholders that allow you to make a difference in this area.
And Alice, very helpful comments. When you speak about NARUC, that's the National Association of State Utility Regulators, and a perfect location to discuss these types of issues. And PUCs are public utility commissions, which are members of the of NARUC, and Aaron in New Orleans, as we mentioned earlier, is the equivalent of a PUC, Public Utility Commission, for the city of New Orleans, uniquely. And
I am not a PUC. There's 7 council members.
Thank you. And David, what observations do you have? And then in a few minutes, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kind of just give us a lightning round conclusion to our comments. But what you've heard our discussion, what do you see as additional potential solutions or things we need to focus on more carefully, either at the political level, regulatory level, legislative level, or funding level?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if this is too out of bounds to add another level, but I do think we want to also not forget the very local community level and just think about we talk a lot about like the last mile, about how you bring connectivity to a building, but at least one of the issues that we see in cities like New York is that even when the infrastructure exists, and technically there is 1 or maybe 2 or 3 choices for internet service, people are not able to sign up. And whether that's because of an affordability issue or because of a lack of digital literacy or lack of access to devices, you can have the best infrastructure in the world, but if people don't have any on-ramp into that, then it's really not solving the problem that we're all trying to address. I think it's positive that some of the recent federal support has included carve-outs for digital equity programs. And then, of course, there are things like the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provides a $30 per month ongoing subsidy for people who qualify through a variety of different social welfare type programs. But all of those things only work if you can get both the knowledge out there, but also establish the trust. Because in some cases, if a person has had a bad experience with, say, their cable provider in the past, and maybe they weren't able to pay a bill, or maybe they had a dispute or something like that, and then now they get a flyer in the mail that says, good news, there's a free federal program where you can get internet service, they may not actually believe that because it does sound a little bit too good to be true. And I found that the best people for really addressing those types of barriers are people from the communities themselves. I'm personally a big fan of some of the wireless networking work that's been done really on the ground through groups like Community Tech New York and NYC Mesh that have really brought together volunteers from neighborhoods and done skills training as a piece of this, but actually get people involved in the process of setting up or maintaining a network. It brings a level of local community ownership and buy-in to this work that otherwise can be lost if it's just something that they're reading about in the newspaper or getting an email about a new program's availability. Just want to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that the infrastructure is critical, but it's not the last link in the chain, right? There ultimately has to be we're talking about human beings that need to feel that this is a service that is valuable to them. It's something that they can trust, whether it's from a data privacy perspective or from just a financial perspective, to really be able to close the divide that we've been speaking about.
Thank you, David. Great comments, as with all of our panelists today. I'm going to now move into our lightning round, ask each speaker to really just take a few sentences or a moment to really drive home whatever you feel is the most important point that you want to convey to our audience today. And I'll go in reverse sequence. So I'll start with Todd, and then David, then Alice, Aaron, and Tiago.
So out of respect for my fellow panelists who will have probably better things to say than I will keep it very short. I think the way that we get to equity in broadband and this ubiquitous spread is by looking at the problem or the challenge from the multifaceted lens that we need to. Because everything from like what David said about needing to have people who are local in the community being the ones who are actually deciding how this, what particular problems are holding broadband back there, because they're not the same in every community. Trying to create incentives so that every dollar that's spent, whether it's coming from the government or it's private investment, serves not only the immediate purpose, but also potentially the purpose of making the investment useful to multiple parties, whether that's within the same area, sort of horizontally, or whether it's vertically, meaning that this middle mile investment that you made can serve even more communities at one end and can be connected to a backbone on the other end. So, thinking about this problem, both at sort of that micro level and also at that, how can we make this as useful as possible for as many people as possible for as long a time as possible? And that's hard. So it's not like this is going to be magically solved. But until we start thinking about it, about both the trees and the forest at the same time, we won't make any serious dents on these problems.
Thank you, Todd. David.
I like the concept of both the forest and the trees, because so much of what we've been talking about is multi-dimensional. I think for me, the key point here is this is not fundamentally a technology issue, and it's also not a binary, is a person served or unserved by infrastructure. It's really getting the technology, policy, and a sustainable business model aligned in a way that can actually provide service that that solves critical needs for people. So I like to think about it in terms of the energy system. No one talks about what voltage electricity they have at home or what shape the plug is or anything like that. And I think we still have a ways to go in the broadband world to get to that point where we don't need to talk about how many megabits download, versus upstream speed do you have, whether it's, what's the pros and cons of satellite versus fiber versus coax, all those things. I really hope that we in the near future can get to a point in time where there is both a robust set of choices available, but also a high enough overall quality of service that we really have more choices and more people connected, and that's really going to take a partnership across all of these sectors.
Thank you, David. Alice.
Yeah, Clint, from my perspective, I would say that don't try to do it alone. There's so many resources out there. What we're hearing from this conversation today, that so many great ideas or precedents that's been set. If any organization or entity in particular is looking to solve the digital divide in some way, there are organizations that are set up to do so, right? Tiago's organization would be a great one. I think about the Utility Broadband Alliance or other, Edison Electric Institute, EI. There are forums that these discussions are happening, that they're bringing multiple stakeholders together to solve those issues. And you could even go visit some of these entities that already embarked on demonstrating the art of the possible, how it can be done. So I think oftentimes we see the multiple challenges that exist as to the 100 reasons why not. I think there are opportunities to look at folks that are stepping out of that logjam and identifying this is what we have done, because it's important for folks to say, yes, it's possible, and let's actually go build something bigger and better.
Thank you, Alice. I want to connect you with Tiago after this webinar so that you two can develop these thoughts, especially on convening with more care. Erin, we've been fortunate to have you for the duration of this webinar, and I know that has not been easy, so we're really appreciative.
No, I mean, thank you all, and I apologize if I've been looking away every few minutes. We actually have some issues on the council agenda that are related to what we're discussing today, and so I've just been sort of troubleshooting those while participating. I want to say, and something that we haven't focused on a lot is, it's actually going to piggyback off of Alice's point that we can't do this alone. There's no one entity that is going to be able to accomplish the goals that we've discussed here, particularly coming from a government perspective. There aren't enough city employees who can accomplish these tasks. And I will also say that when cities as governments are trying to find the path forward, our concerns are cost, ensuring that even if you have all the right wires and going into the house, that you can also have a router and a device that actually makes that access meaningful. But also that in getting that access, we aren't also making already marginalized communities at risk for data theft and identity theft and things like that. And the fact of the matter is, most city employees are not experts in this field, and we don't want to run the risk of losing an entire generation because we're afraid to work together. And I think the only path forward to ensure an equitable future is our ability to work as a team to accomplish these tasks. So that's my nutshell.
Very powerful. Todd.
Can I just compliment Erin on something that she just said? The fact that you're trying to solve these problems and recognizing that you don't know the best way to solve it, which for a regulator is just critical. I would sort of point to the experience of VoIP. Way back when, VoIP, from my perspective, had huge potential. And then there was a spectacular event where an infant died because somebody was a Vonage customer, and they went to call 911, and of course Vonage didn't offer 911 service. And so when they went to dial the number, it says, please hang up and dial 911. And in the panic, the parent would just pick up Vonage again and try dialing. Well, of course, the infant died. And so the FCC at the next meeting kicked off an initiative to mandate that 911 be offered on every VoIP service offering. And while that goal sounds noble, it ruined VoIP. VoIP went from being a creative technology that could offer people possibilities to a cost competitor, right? So now mostly VoIP is sort of viewed as a cost competitor to other voice services, and a lot of the most innovative features of it never developed. And so I think that the fact that you even view it this way is amazing. So kudos to you and to New Orleans, that trying to support things without sort of mandating a specific result or limiting the benefits that technology can bring if they're, steered and facilitated in the right direction.
Thank you for that, Todd. And Tiago, we're going to give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you, Clayton. I will try to do my best to honor such a big panel and fantastic group of experts. I will take just a moment to recognize the importance of broadband connectivity, and I can even say wireless broadband as well. It's a central point for the modernization of societies, and this can be at a local level or a state level or even national level. It's with this increased access to connectivity that we can in part generate more economic growth, somehow be more efficient sharing all different types of infrastructure, either in a city with the, traffic lights, it can be at the national level with the trains, it can be in numerous use cases that we can identify. And at the end of the day, will improve as well our quality of life. And we all mentioned that the pandemic showed that. And if we manage to have this economic growth, improve our quality of life, more efficient use of all the resources available in the world, definitely we can have a better well-being for everyone. But for this to happen, I think the conclusion of this panel, yes, we need more collaboration, we need more infrastructure sharing, we need more partnerships, we need better regulation, better legislation, and as well, better education and making sure that everyone can use the broadband and can take the benefits out of it. And as well, technology interoperability and more ability to have these convergence of technologies, and we are not all having stakeholders looking to the broadband in silos, but we have transversal visions for this broadband connectivity. It's a very difficult puzzle to crack, but I think today we gave a good dialogue, and we raised some of the potential solutions, or at least the path, some paths for the solutions that may be pursued.
What a really spectacular panel, and what a wonderful and candid discussion of a seemingly intractable issue that with leaders like you, we're going to solve. We have to solve it. And I can't thank you enough. We will have a recording of this presentation for all of our colleagues who were on spring break with their families or couldn't meet this time frame, and we will put this out on our website, on our law firm. And then I hope that Jennifer will work with you all on developing an essay or two, because your points today were really so compelling and helpful and should be amplified. So with that, I'm going to, on behalf of our audience, I'm going to give you an ovation and special appreciation. What a great job. Thank you, and have a wonderful remainder of the day.